Picture this. It's the end of the week, you've done what needed to be done, work handled, bills paid, problems solved. You sit down, not dramatically, not lazily, you just sit. Within minutes, something shifts. A sigh you didn't ask for, a comment that sounds casual, but isn't, a task that suddenly can't wait. Must be nice, there's still so much to do, you're really just going to sit there. Nothing was wrong 5 minutes ago. Nothing urgent appeared out of nowhere. The only thing that changed is that you stopped moving. Men notice this pattern early, even if they don't have words for it yet. Rest doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives with resistance. You're not being accused of doing something wrong, you're being accused of not doing. And that distinction matters, because this reaction isn't about productivity, it's not about fairness, it's not even about the work itself, it's about what your stillness represents. A man at rest is hard to place. He's not chasing, he's not reacting, he's not proving anything. And for some women, that creates discomfort they can't explain, only act out. That's why the interruption comes fast, before you settle in, before you enjoy it, before peace fully arrives. You'll notice the timing is never random. It doesn't happen when you're exhausted but still moving. It doesn't happen when you're working late. It doesn't happen when you're stressed and distracted. It happens when you look calm, when you look unbothered, when you look finished. At least for the moment, that's the trigger. Not laziness, not irresponsibility, not neglect, peace. A man sitting still sends a quiet signal, I'm not under pressure right now. And that signal unsettles certain relationship dynamics, because pressure is useful. Pressure keeps men predictable. Pressure keeps them oriented outward. Pressure keeps them earning, fixing, solving. But rest removes pressure. And without pressure, a man becomes harder to manage. This is why the reaction often isn't logical. It's emotional, instinctive. You could list everything you've already done that day. It won't help. You could explain that you'll handle it later. It won't matter. You could even offer to help after you rest. The irritation remains. Because the issue isn't the task, it's the pause. Men feel this confusion deeply. I worked all week. Why does resting feel like I'm doing something wrong? That's because somewhere along the way, men were conditioned to associate rest with guilt. You don't relax, you earn rest. And even then, you're expected to rush through it. 5 minutes is acceptable, 10 is questionable. Anything more becomes suspicious, especially if you look content. A relaxed man doesn't broadcast urgency. He doesn't appear needy. He doesn't look like he's trying to secure approval. And that absence of urgency can feel like loss of influence to someone who relies on it. So rest gets reframed. It becomes laziness. It becomes selfishness. It becomes immaturity. Not because those labels are accurate, but because they're effective. They pull you back into motion. And once you're moving again, fixing something, doing something, responding to something, the tension fades. Peace was the problem. Movement was the solution. That's why this pattern repeats so reliably. The moment you stop, the system corrects you. Not with anger at first, with irritation, with sarcasm, with subtle pressure. And if that doesn't work, escalation. This is where many men begin to internalize the rule without realizing it. Rest must be justified. Peace must be explained. Stillness must be earned. But here's the truth most men don't hear early enough. Your rest isn't triggering anger because you're failing. It's triggering anger because you've temporarily stepped outside a role you were expected to stay inside. And once you understand that, the situation stops feeling confusing and starts feeling revealing. That's where we go next. Section 2. Why male rest feels like a threat. A man at rest doesn't look dangerous, but psychologically he can be, because rest changes what a man has access to. When you're tired, you react. When you're busy, you comply. When you're exhausted, you don't question much, you just move. That's why constant motion is comfortable for certain relationship dynamics. It keeps things stable, predictable, controlled. But rest breaks that pattern. Rest gives a man space, and space gives him awareness. When a man finally slows down, something uncomfortable can happen. He starts noticing things. He notices how he feels. He notices what drains him. He notices what doesn't make sense anymore. And that awareness is disruptive, because an aware man is harder to direct. This is why some women don't react to male exhaustion. They rely on it. But male recovery? That's different. Recovery restores clarity. Clarity restores choice. And choice is the real threat. A man who's always tired doesn't ask big questions. He doesn't reevaluate the relationship. He doesn't reconsider how his time is being used. He's just trying to survive the day. But a rested man, he might realize he's overextending. He might notice imbalance. He might question why his needs always come last. So the system reacts early, before rest becomes reflection, before reflection becomes change. This is why the pushback often feels urgent. You've been sitting too long. We should be doing something. There's no time to relax. It's not about productivity. It's about preventing stillness from turning into awareness. There's another layer here that rarely gets spoken about. Some women feel secure when a man is in motion because motion signals purpose. A moving man looks useful. A working man looks needed. But a resting man looks self-contained. He doesn't appear to be chasing validation. He doesn't look like he's trying to prove worth. He looks complete, at least in that moment. And that can feel threatening to someone whose sense of security depends on being central to a man's motivation. If you're always working for something, someone else can position themselves as the reason. But if you're resting peacefully, no one is being earned. You're just being. That independence is unsettling in certain dynamics. It creates a quiet question: if he doesn't need to stay busy to feel okay, what does that mean for my influence? So rest gets reframed as irresponsibility, not because it is, but because responsibility language justifies interference, and men, conditioned to be responsible, respond immediately. They get up, they engage, they comply, the discomfort disappears. Not because things are better. This is also why male rest often triggers comments about potential. You could be doing more. You're wasting time. You're capable of so much. On the surface, it sounds supportive. Underneath, it's anxiety talking, because rest looks like stagnation to someone who equates movement with safety. And for some people, a man who isn't striving looks like a man who might stop striving for them. There's an unspoken fear here. A rested man might redirect his energy toward hobbies, toward health, toward independence, or worse, toward reconsidering the relationship itself. So the safest option is to keep him tired. Not consciously, not maliciously, but functionally. And that's why the irritation feels disproportionate. It's not about what you're doing in that moment. It's about what your rest could lead to. Clarity, autonomy, change, which is why peace doesn't get attacked directly, it gets interrupted. And that interruption becomes normal. So normal that many men stop resting altogether. Not because they don't need it, but because it feels easier to stay moving than to deal with the reaction. But that comes at a cost, and that cost shows up later. That's what we need to talk about next. Section 3. The guilt that keeps you moving. At first, the pressure is external. A comment, a look, a sigh. But over time, something else happens. You start doing it to yourself. You sit down and feel uneasy. You open a video and feel irresponsible. You rest and feel like you're forgetting something important. Even when no one says a word, that's how the system locks in. Guilt is far more efficient than confrontation. It doesn't require reminders. It doesn't require arguments. Once installed, it runs automatically. Most men don't realize when this shift happens. They just know they can't fully relax anymore. Their body is resting, their mind isn't. They're waiting for interruption or punishing themselves before it arrives. This is how rest turns into something that must be justified. You don't just relax, you explain why you're relaxing. I worked late all week. I'll handle it after. I just need a few minutes. Notice the pattern. Rest becomes a defense, not a right. And the more you defend it, the more it looks negotiable. This guilt doesn't come from laziness. It comes from moral framing. Some men are taught, subtly, repeatedly, that a good man is always useful. If you're not producing, you should be preparing. If you're not fixing, you should be planning. If you're not working, you should be available. So when you choose stillness, it feels like a violation, not of a rule you agreed to, but of an expectation you absorbed. That's why the guilt feels vague. You can't point to what you're doing wrong. You just feel wrong doing nothing. And certain partners learn how to activate this without saying much. They don't demand, they imply. They clean loudly, they reorganize things that don't need organizing. They just mention tasks casually, not as requests, as signals. And because you don't want to be the kind of man who ignores signals, you get up. The moment you move, the tension disappears, which reinforces the behavior. Your body learns, rest creates discomfort, movement restores harmony. So you move, even when you're exhausted, even when you're depleted, even when your body is asking for recovery. Over time, this creates a dangerous internal rule. If I rest, I'm letting someone down. And that belief reshapes your behavior. You stop scheduling downtime. You feel anxious during hobbies. You multitask rest with productivity just to ease the guilt. Relaxing while checking emails. Watching something while planning tomorrow. Resting, but not really resting. Because true rest, full disengagement, feels forbidden. This is where many men become permanently tired. Not from work alone, but from never fully recovering. And the irony is this. The same people who benefit from your constant availability often don't notice when you're running on empty. They only notice when you stop. That's when rest suddenly becomes a problem. This is also why conversations about fairness rarely help. You can explain how much you do, you can list responsibilities, you can point out imbalance. But guilt doesn't respond to logic, it responds to identity. If you believe your value comes from output, then rest will always feel like failure, regardless of the facts. And once that belief is in place, no one has to push you anymore. You'll interrupt your own peace. You'll stand up before anyone asks. You'll abandon rest before it feels complete. You'll stay busy just to avoid the discomfort. That's the most efficient form of control. Not enforced from the outside, but accepted on the inside. The question is no longer, why does she get angry when I rest? The real question becomes, why do I feel wrong for needing rest at all? And once a man starts asking that question, something begins to change, because guilt loses its grip the moment it's seen clearly, and that's where the dynamic starts to crack. Next, we need to talk about what this is really about and what it isn't, because it was never about chores. Section 4, it was never about the work. If you listen closely, the argument always sounds practical. There's still stuff to do. We can't just sit around. This needs to get done. On the surface, it looks reasonable. But if you pay attention to patterns instead of words, something becomes clear. The work is never the real issue, because the same tasks existed before you sat down. They weren't urgent 5 minutes ago. They weren't causing stress an hour earlier. They only become important when you stop moving. That timing matters. If this were truly about getting things done, rest could be scheduled, downtime could be respected, recovery could be planned. But that's not how it plays out, because the real issue isn't productivity, it's authority over your time. Who decides when you stop? Who decides when you're allowed to disengage? In healthy dynamics, that decision belongs to you. In unhealthy ones, it becomes negotiated or quietly assumed. This is why men's hobbies often get treated differently than women's downtime. Her activities are framed as self-care, decompression, connection. Yours are framed as avoidance, distraction, immaturity. Not because of what you're doing, but because of what your attention is no longer doing. It's no longer directed outward. A man focused on his own interests is a man not fully available, and availability is currency. Some partners feel safest when a man's time is predictable, accessible, and easily redirected. Rest disrupts that. Rest doesn't ask permission. It doesn't respond immediately. It doesn't revolve around anyone else's needs. So it gets challenged, not directly, but strategically, by creating urgency, by invoking responsibility, by framing stillness as neglect. This is why the pressure often increases on weekends. Work already owns your weekdays, so the only remaining space to reclaim control is your recovery time. Saturday becomes catch-up day. Sunday becomes prep day. By Monday, you're tired again. The cycle stays intact, and if you point this out, you're often met with confusion or defensiveness. Things still need to get done. I'm just trying to be productive. I don't understand why this is a problem, because from their perspective, constant motion feels normal. Stillness feels wrong. But here's the critical distinction. There's a difference between shared responsibility and total access. Shared responsibility means both people contribute, while respecting recovery. Total access means your energy is assumed to be available at all times, and that second model burns men out, because it leaves no space that belongs to you, no time that isn't accountable, no energy that isn't pre-allocated. Rest becomes theft. Downtime becomes selfishness. Recovery becomes indulgence, not because those things are inherently wrong, but because they reduce how much of you is usable. And when a man starts protecting his time, something interesting happens. The reaction intensifies, because now it's not just rest, it's boundaries. And boundaries change power dynamics. They force clarity. They reveal whether the relationship is built on mutual respect or unspoken entitlement. This is why some men notice that the more self-sufficient they become, the more friction appears. Not because they're doing less, but because they're doing it without constant explanation. And for someone used to access, that feels like loss of control, loss of influence, loss of leverage. So the conflict escalates, not over tasks, but over who gets to decide. That's the real fight. And once you see that, the guilt starts to loosen its hold. Because you realize something important. You're not failing a duty. You're reclaiming ownership of your time. And that's where the dynamic either adjusts or breaks. Which leads to an important distinction most men need to understand. Not all partners react this way, and that difference matters more than you think. That's where we go next. Section 5. The difference that changes everything. This is where the conversation needs balance, because not all women react negatively to male rest, and that distinction matters. Healthy partners don't see your recovery as withdrawal. They see it as maintenance. They understand something simple that often gets lost. A man who never rests doesn't become more present, he becomes depleted. Supportive women don't compete with your peace, they protect it. They notice when you're tired before you say anything. They encourage downtime instead of interrupting it. They don't interpret your stillness as rejection, because their sense of security doesn't depend on your exhaustion. In these relationships, rest is neutral, sometimes even positive. A rested man is calmer, clearer, more patient, more grounded, and those qualities strengthen connection. Contrast that with unhealthy dynamics. Here, rest isn't neutral, it's threatening. Not because you've done something wrong, but because your independence becomes visible. You're not seeking direction, you're not proving usefulness, you're not scrambling for approval, you're simply existing. And that existence doesn't revolve around anyone else. For someone who needs to feel central to your purpose, that's destabilizing. So rest gets reframed as a problem to solve. Why are you always tired? Why don't you have more energy? Why don't you want to do anything? Notice how recovery gets pathologized. You're not resting, you're unmotivated. You're not decompressing, you're checked out. You're not taking care of yourself, you're losing drive. This framing serves one purpose, to pull you back into motion, because motion restores familiarity, and familiarity feels safe to someone who relies on it. Healthy partners don't need you constantly busy to feel secure. Unhealthy ones do. That's the line. One sees you as a person, the other sees you as a role. One wants you well, the other wants you useful, and this difference shows up clearly over time. Ask yourself, do they create space for your recovery, or fill it with demands? Do they respect your downtime, or monitor it? Do they support your hobbies, or tolerate them with resentment? These aren't small questions. They determine whether your nervous system can ever fully relax around someone. Because if rest always comes with tension, your body learns that peace isn't safe. And living like that takes a toll. Many men in these dynamics don't realize how tired they are until they're alone. Not just physically, mentally, the constant low-level pressure, the vigilance, the need to stay productive to avoid friction. That's not partnership, that's management. Healthy women don't manage men through guilt. They don't measure love by exhaustion. They don't equate motion with commitment. They understand that rest doesn't take away from the relationship, it supports it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When a man finally insists on protecting his rest, the relationship reveals itself quickly. Supportive partners adjust, controlling ones resist, not with logic, but with emotion, because boundaries expose intentions. They show who benefits from your depletion and who benefits from your health. That's why the next phase is so important, because when men stop apologizing for rest, things change, and not everyone is prepared for that shift. That's where we go next. Section 6. What changes when you stop apologizing for rest? Something shifts the moment a man stops explaining himself. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly. He sits down without checking the clock. He rests without listing reasons. He doesn't rush to justify recovery. And that silence changes the dynamic more than arguments ever could. Because guilt only works when you accept it. The moment you stop apologizing for rest, one of two things happens. Some relationships stabilize, others destabilize fast. Supportive partners adjust quickly. They notice the calm, they respect the boundary, they adapt. But in unhealthy dynamics, resistance increases. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the old levers no longer work. The sigh doesn't move you, the comment doesn't hurry you, the implied task doesn't pull you up, and that loss of influence creates anxiety. So pressure escalates, rest becomes framed as neglect, boundaries get labeled as selfishness, stillness gets interpreted as distance. You've changed, you're not the same anymore, you don't care like you used to. In a sense, that's true, you no longer care at the expense of your health. And that's the real turning point, because exhausted men are compliant, rested men are selective. They think more clearly, they notice patterns, they feel their own limits. And once a man reconnects with his limits, he stops living in reaction mode. He chooses. That choice alone can destabilize relationships built on unspoken expectations. This is why some men experience conflict after they start taking care of themselves, not before. The relationship didn't change, the balance did. And balance always reveals what was being propped up by overextension. Here's the part many men don't anticipate. You don't have to announce boundaries for them to exist. You enforce them by behavior, by resting anyway, by not rushing to prove worth, by letting discomfort exist without fixing it. At first, that feels unnatural, because men are conditioned to smooth things over, to reduce tension, to keep things moving. But peace isn't something you negotiate away, it's something you protect. And when you do, clarity follows. You see who respects your humanity and who resents it. That information is invaluable because it tells you whether you're in a partnership or a performance. And once that becomes clear, there's no going back. That's why this conversation has to end with something grounded, not anger, not blame, clarity. That's where we close this. Section 7. The line that has to be drawn. Rest is not a reward, it's maintenance. You don't rest because you've earned permission. You rest because your body and mind require it. Any relationship that treats recovery as optional will eventually treat you the same way. The test is simple. Does your partner protect your rest or interrupt it? Do they create space for your recovery or fill every pause with demands? Do they feel calmer when you're well or more anxious? Those answers matter, because someone who loves you wants you healthy. Someone who needs you useful wants you tired. This isn't about winning arguments. It's about choosing sustainability. Men who never rest burn out. Men who burn out become resentful. Men who live resentful lives lose themselves. Rest prevents that. And the men who learn to protect it early live better lives, clearer minds, stronger bodies, healthier relationships. So stop apologizing for sitting down. Stop explaining why you're tired. Stop treating recovery like a flaw. Your peace doesn't need approval. And anyone who resents your rest is telling you something important. Listen to it. That's where this ends. Conclusion: rest isn't laziness, it's maintenance. A man who never recovers doesn't become stronger. He becomes worn down, resentful, and disconnected from himself. Any relationship that demands constant motion at the cost of your health isn't asking for love, it's asking for sacrifice without limit. Pay attention to how your rest is treated, protected or punished, respected or interrupted. That reaction tells you everything. If this message hit close to home, you're not alone. Many men are starting to see the same pattern and choosing peace over pressure. Drop a comment if you've experienced this. Share how your rest is received, and if you value clarity, boundaries, and self-respect, make sure you're subscribed.